Imagine returning to your hometown, seeking peace and purpose, only to uncover hidden tension and imminent danger. Marcus Johnson, a former soldier turned police officer, faces not just crime, but a corrupt system thriving in the shadows. Something dark lurks beneath Cape May, and he knows that fighting it could cost him everything. How long until the true enemy reveals itself? And when it does, will he be ready?
Marcus Johnson stared out the window of the bus as it rumbled down the narrow highway, the landscape of southern small towns rolling by in a blur of dusty greens and faded browns. Cape May wasn't far now, a small, quiet town tucked away in the heart of Mississippi. A place he'd called home once, a lifetime ago, before the war, before everything changed. After serving multiple tours in Afghanistan, Marcus had hoped to come back to a life of peace, of purpose. His military service had granted him respect and a sense of pride, but the transition to civilian life had been rougher than expected. Jobs were scarce, and the support for veterans even scarcer. That's when he received a call from Chief Rollins, the police chief of Cape May. The town needed officers, and Marcus, decorated, disciplined, and familiar with the area, seemed like the perfect fit. The bus pulled into Cape May's only station, a small, weathered building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. As Marcus stepped off, the warm, heavy air wrapped around him like a blanket. This wasn't the dry heat of Afghanistan, this was the oppressive humidity of the Deep South, thick and suffocating. Marcus adjusted his bag on his shoulder and made his way toward the small police department a few blocks away. Walking through the town, he felt the familiar gaze of locals. They eyed him cautiously, with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. He was a big man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a military bearing that seemed to stand out even more in his civilian clothes. Cape May wasn't used to new faces, especially not ones like his. He could sense the unspoken questions in their eyes. Who's this guy? What's his story? When Marcus finally arrived at the department, Chief Rollins greeted him with a handshake that was firm but perfunctory. "Glad to have you back, Johnson," Rollins said, his southern drawl slow and deliberate. "The town's grown a bit since you were last here. You'll find it's the same in many ways, but people ain't as trusting as they used to be." Marcus nodded, already feeling the weight of the chief's words. Cape May had always been a place slow to change, steeped in tradition, where everyone knew everyone else's business. As Rollins gave him a tour of the station, introducing him to the handful of officers on duty, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in this town while he was gone. Travis Walker, a veteran officer with a gruff exterior, offered Marcus a tight smile. "Heard you were in the war," Walker said, his tone flat. "Bet you've seen some things." Marcus simply nodded. He'd learned a long time ago not to indulge curiosity when it came to his military past. People either wanted to glorify it or pity it, neither reaction appealed to him. As the day wore on, Marcus settled into his new role. Cape May was as slow and predictable as it had ever been, with little more than petty thefts and occasional bar fights filling the station's blotter. Still, something about the way his colleagues interacted with him left him uneasy. They were polite, but distant. Respectful, but cautious. There was a wall there, invisible but tangible, and Marcus felt its presence every time someone spoke to him or looked his way. That evening, as Marcus walked through the quiet streets toward his small, rented apartment, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. He had expected some of this. After all, Cape May was still a small, southern town, and he was a black man who had spent the better part of a decade overseas. But the unease went deeper than that. It was in the way people spoke, in the silence that lingered too long after his words, and in the way their eyes slid past him just a bit too quickly. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. Marcus sat on the small porch, staring out at the street, his mind restless. This place, his hometown, felt foreign now, and the isolation was heavier than he had anticipated. The discipline and structure of military life were gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. But as he sat there, Marcus made a quiet vow to himself. He wasn't here just to pass the time or to collect a paycheck. He was here to make a difference. Cape May might be stuck in its old ways, but he'd fought through worse before. He could handle this. He had to. As the warm night settled in around him, Marcus closed his eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the familiar sounds of the southern night to wash over him, crickets chirping, the distant hum of a car engine, the soft rustle of trees in the breeze. He could do this. He would do this. But deep down, he knew that Cape May wasn't going to make it easy for him. Marcus had only been on the force for a couple of weeks when he began noticing the cracks in Cape May's facade. At first glance, the town seemed peaceful, almost sleepy, with little happening beyond the occasional minor disturbance. But beneath the surface, there was a tension, a quiet discomfort that felt ever-present. One afternoon, Marcus was assigned to patrol with Officer Travis Walker. Walker had been with the department for nearly 20 years, and it showed in his hardened demeanor. He was the kind of cop who prided himself on knowing everything about everyone in town. "You'll get to know folks around here soon enough," Walker had said when they set out on patrol. "Just keep your eyes open, and don't stick your nose where it don't belong." They'd been driving for about an hour when a call came through the radio. Something about a suspicious person near the old railroad tracks on the edge of town. Walker grunted and turned the car around. When they arrived, Marcus spotted a young man, no older than his early 20s, standing near the tracks. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his hands. Marcus recognized that look, the fear of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man's skin was darker than most of the residents in Cape May, and Marcus's gut tightened as he watched Walker step out of the patrol car. "Hey!" Walker barked, his voice carrying a hard edge. "What you doing out here?" The young man froze, his eyes wide. I was just walking home," he stammered, his gaze flicking between Walker and Marcus. "I live just over that way." He pointed vaguely toward a group of small, run-down houses in the distance. Walker didn't seem to hear him. He walked right up to the kid, towering over him with his arms crossed. "Walking, huh? You sure you ain't up to something else?" Marcus felt the familiar twist of unease in his stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. The young man hadn't done anything to warrant this level of aggression. He stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, maybe we can just ask him a few questions and let him go," Marcus said, keeping his tone calm. "He doesn't seem to be causing any trouble." Walker shot him a glare. "We don't need to go easy on people like him. You'll see soon enough, Johnson. These types, they'll say anything to get out of trouble." Marcus clenched his jaw but stayed silent. The types Walker referred to were people of color, just like him. He'd seen this attitude before, in the military, in cities, in other places where prejudice ran deep but was rarely spoken aloud. It never got easier to witness. Walker turned back to the young man, now visibly trembling. "Empty your pockets," Walker demanded, his voice cold and commanding. The kid hesitated, but eventually did as he was told, pulling out nothing but a few crumpled bills and some loose change. It was clear he wasn't hiding anything, but Walker wasn't satisfied. "Why are you hanging around here? Looking to cause trouble?" Walker asked, his tone accusatory. "I swear, I wasn't doing anything," the young man pleaded. "I'm just trying to get home." Marcus stepped forward again, this time more firmly. "He's got nothing on him, Walker. Let's just let him go." Walker turned to Marcus, his eyes narrowing. For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes, and Marcus could feel the hostility simmering beneath the surface. Walker was the kind of officer who thrived on control, and Marcus had just challenged that control. Without a word, Walker turned back to the young man. "Get out of here," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "And don't let me catch you around here again." The young man wasted no time, darting away down the dirt path as fast as his legs could carry him. Marcus watched him go, relief washing over him, but it was quickly replaced by anger. He turned to Walker. "That wasn't necessary," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He wasn't doing anything wrong." Walker shrugged, unfazed. "You're new here, Johnson. You'll learn." People like that, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to tell Walker that he was wrong, but he knew it would be pointless. There was a deep-seated mentality here, one that wasn't going to change overnight. He'd seen it before. This wasn't just about one cop and one kid. It was about a system, an attitude that had been allowed to fester in places like Cape May for generations. The rest of the patrol passed in tense silence. Walker didn't seem bothered by what had happened, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The corruption, the prejudice, it was there, lurking just beneath the surface, and Marcus had stepped into the middle of it. That night, back at his apartment, Marcus replayed the scene in his mind. He couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated, how easily Walker had slipped into his role as aggressor. The worst part was that no one seemed to care. And Cape May, this was just another day on the job. Marcus sat in the dark for a long time, his mind racing. He had come here to make a difference, to serve his community in a meaningful way. But now, it was clear that Cape May wasn't going to make it easy for him. If anything, this town was going to fight him at every turn. But Marcus had never been one to back down from a fight. Not in the military, not in life. And now, it seemed, Cape May had just given him a new battle to fight. The next morning, Marcus walked into the station with a heavy sense of purpose. He couldn't let what had happened the previous day slide. If that was how things were done in Cape May, then something had to change, and he wasn't going to sit idly by and let it continue. As he sat at his desk, Marcus replayed the scene with Walker in his mind. It wasn't just a small-town cop being overly cautious, it was blatant abuse of power, and Marcus knew it. He couldn't forget the fear in that young man's eyes, the way he had been treated for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and, worse, the wrong color. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stood up and headed toward the office of Chief Rollins. The chief's door was slightly ajar, and Marcus could hear him talking on the phone, his voice low and serious. Marcus waited for a moment, then knocked gently. "Come in," Rollins called out, glancing up from his desk as Marcus entered. He raised an eyebrow. "Johnson, what can I do for you?" Marcus closed the door behind him and stood in front of the chief's desk. "I need to talk to you about what happened on patrol yesterday," he began, his tone measured. Rollins leaned back in his chair, a look of mild curiosity crossing his face. "Go on." Marcus recounted the incident with Walker, explaining how the young man had been harassed and intimidated for no reason. He tried to keep his emotions in check, sticking to the facts, but his frustration was evident. By the time he finished, Rollins was watching him with a slightly narrowed gaze, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause. Rollins didn't speak right away, and the silence stretched uncomfortably between them. Finally, Rollins sighed. "Johnson, I get where you're coming from, but you need to understand something about this town." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "People here don't like change. They don't like outsiders, and they sure as hell don't like people coming in and telling them how to do things." Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "With all due respect, Chief, what happened yesterday wasn't about change. It was wrong, plain and simple. That kid didn't do anything, and Walker treated him like a criminal just because of how he looked." Rollins waved a hand dismissively. "Look, I know Walker can be rough around the edges, but he knows this town, knows the people. Sometimes you've got to trust the instincts of those who've been here longer. Maybe that kid didn't do anything this time, but I guarantee you he's trouble. Walker's got a good sense for that." Marcus stared at the chief, disbelief creeping into his expression. "You're saying it's okay to harass someone just because you think they might be trouble down the line? That's not how policing is supposed to work." Rollins's face hardened. "Don't tell me how policing is supposed to work in Cape May, Johnson. You're new here. You haven't seen what we've seen, dealt with what we've dealt with. This isn't some big city where the rules are different. Here, we do things our way because it works. And I'm telling you, Walker was just doing his job." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to keep his temper in check. I didn't sign up to look the other way, Chief. I signed up to protect and serve, no matter who it is. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, Marcus thought Rollins might actually listen. But then the chief's expression shifted, closing off completely. Here's some advice, Johnson, Rollins said, his voice colder now. Keep your head down, do your job, and don't go stirring up trouble where there isn't any. You're new to this town, and if you want to stick around, you do well to remember that. Marcus stood there, stunned by the bluntness of the message. Rollins wasn't just brushing off what had happened, he was telling Marcus to let it go, to accept it as part of the job. It was infuriating, and yet, Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culture of Cape May's police force, and maybe even the town as a whole. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the chief's office, his mind reeling. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He went through the motions of his duties, but his thoughts were consumed by what had transpired. The chief's words echoed in his head, "Don't stir up trouble where there isn't any." But Marcus knew there was trouble. The kind that festered beneath the surface, invisible until someone like Walker dragged it out into the open. And now that Marcus had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He couldn't ignore it. The next few days at the station were tense. Word spread quickly that Marcus had gone to the chief about Walker, and while no one said anything to his face, the shift in attitudes was palpable. Conversations grew quieter when he entered a room, and officers who had been friendly before now gave him cold, guarded looks. Even Walker barely acknowledged his presence, but when their eyes met, there was an unspoken threat lurking there. It was clear, Marcus had become an outsider not just in the town, but within the department itself. That night, as Marcus sat alone in his apartment, he stared out the window at the quiet streets of Cape May. He had hoped to come back here and make a difference, to be part of something bigger. But now, it felt like the town had closed in around him, pushing him to the margins. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. A week after his conversation with Chief Rollins, Marcus could feel the weight of isolation bearing down on him. His colleagues treated him like an outsider now, and the air at the station had become thick with tension. The camaraderie that existed before was gone. Even the smallest tasks felt loaded with suspicion, and Marcus knew that something was brewing beneath the surface. He spent his shifts quietly, doing his job, but the unease never left. His instincts, honed from years in the military, told him that it was only a matter of time before things escalated. That escalation came one muggy Friday night. It was a slow shift. Marcus was on patrol alone, driving the back roads near the outskirts of town, where old houses stood in clusters surrounded by empty fields. The radio had been quiet all evening, the kind of silence that usually preceded trouble. Then, a call came through. Suspicious activity at the Cape May convenience store, the dispatcher's voice crackled. Unit 5, respond. Marcus grabbed the radio. Copy that. I'm on my way. He knew the convenience store well. It was one of the few 24-hour places in town, always filled with the late-night stragglers picking up snacks or cigarettes. But something about the call felt off, too vague, too convenient. When Marcus arrived at the store, the parking lot was mostly empty, save for a couple of parked cars. As he stepped out of his cruiser, he immediately felt the tension in the air. There was an eerie stillness, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. As he approached the store, Marcus spotted a figure inside. It was Officer Travis Walker, standing near the back aisle, seemingly browsing the shelves. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. He hadn't expected Walker to be here, and the last time they'd crossed paths, the animosity had been palpable. Before Marcus could fully process the situation, another officer, Danvers, stepped out from behind a display near the entrance. Danvers, a quiet, unassuming guy who'd never given Marcus trouble before, glanced at him but said nothing. His presence only added to Marcus's growing unease. Walker finally looked up, catching sight of Marcus. Evening, Johnson, he said, his tone casual but with an edge that Marcus recognized all too well. Didn't expect to see you here. Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. responding to a call. Everything all right in here? Walker shrugged. Just checking things out myself. Looks quiet enough. But Marcus didn't buy it. Something was wrong. His instincts screamed that this wasn't a coincidence, that Walker being here wasn't by chance. As he moved further into the store, Marcus noticed the cashier, a young woman who was trying to act busy but kept glancing nervously at the officers. She seemed on edge, like she was waiting for something to happen. Marcus caught her eye, but before he could ask if everything was okay, Walker stepped in front of him, blocking his path. You should head out, Johnson, Walker said, his voice low. No need for too many of us in here. I've got this under control. Marcus frowned. I'll stick around, just in case. Walker's jaw clenched. There was a flash of something dark in his eyes before he smiled tightly. Suit yourself. Marcus turned his attention back to the cashier, but before he could speak, Danvers suddenly moved toward the register. He leaned over the counter, speaking too quietly for Marcus to hear, and the cashier's face paled. Marcus's pulse quickened. This was it. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. And then, in a flurry of movement, Walker grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him back toward the center of the store. All right, Johnson. Enough messing around. You're under arrest. For a split second, Marcus thought he'd misheard. What the hell are you talking about? Walker smirked, his grip tightening. We've got reports of a robbery in progress. You fit the description. Marcus's mind raced. He looked around, but it was clear. This was a setup. He hadn't seen it coming, but now it was right in front of him, unfolding like some kind of twisted plan. His heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. Walker and Danvers had been waiting for him. They'd orchestrated the whole thing. Marcus yanked his arm free, stepping back. This is a joke, right? You're trying to frame me? Walker's smile didn't falter. Ain't nobody framing you, Johnson. You're the one acting suspicious. Behind him, Danvers had already pulled out his handcuffs, moving in on Marcus as though this were some routine arrest. Marcus felt the rage building inside him. You think you can just pull this off? You think people aren't going to figure out what you're doing? Walker's smirk widened. Who's gonna believe you, huh? You're new here, Johnson. You don't have anyone on your side. And if I were you, I'd stop making this harder than it needs to be. Marcus's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't give them what they wanted. If he fought back, it would only make things worse. Danvers was already moving toward him, cuffs in hand, when the door to the store swung open. Ethan Cooper stood in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Marcus hadn't seen Ethan in weeks, not since their brief conversation on his first day in town. What the hell is going on here? Ethan demanded, stepping forward. Walker's face hardened. Stay out of this, Cooper. Official police business. Ethan ignored him, his gaze locking onto Marcus. This is a setup, isn't it? They're trying to frame you. Marcus's heart pounded as he stared at Ethan, knowing he was the only witness who could speak up. But before he could respond, Walker stepped in between them. Last warning, Cooper, Walker growled. Back off. Ethan hesitated, glancing between Marcus and the officers. For a moment, Marcus thought he might walk away, but then Ethan clenched his fists. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said quietly, standing his ground. This isn't right. Walker's face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, Marcus felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around his wrists. The cold bite of the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins, but he forced himself to stay composed. As Walker roughly shoved him toward the patrol car, Marcus glanced back at Ethan, who stood frozen in the doorway of the convenience store. His face was pale, but his eyes were filled with determination. The ride to the station was a blur. Walker sat in the front seat, silent, while Danvers kept his eyes fixed on the road. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him, but his mind was already working, strategizing. He had been through worse before, faced enemies far more dangerous than this. But this wasn't a battlefield overseas, this was his own country, his own hometown. And that made it personal. When they arrived at the station, the officers led Marcus inside, barely saying a word. As they booked him, Marcus remained silent, his anger simmering just below the surface. The others in the station looked on with blank expressions, none of them questioning what was happening. It was clear that the culture of silence and complicity ran deep here. After being processed, Marcus was thrown into a holding cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him. He sat down on the cold metal bench, taking a deep breath. His mind raced with possibilities. How far were they willing to go? Would they fabricate evidence, make it look like he was guilty of something he hadn't done? The thought made his stomach turn, but he couldn't let fear cloud his judgment. Hours passed in the dimly lit cell. The steady hum of the station was his only companion as he sat, waiting. Waiting for the next move, for someone to tell him what would happen next. But the longer he sat, the more his resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let them break him, no matter what they threw his way. It was well into the night when the door to the holding area finally opened. A familiar face appeared, Sarah Henderson, the civil rights attorney Marcus had contacted shortly after arriving in Cape May. She had been working on a case involving police misconduct in a nearby county and had become a trusted ally. "Marcus," she said, her voice low but urgent as she approached the cell. "I got the call from Ethan. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here." Marcus stood and walked to the bars, relieved to see a friendly face. "Sarah, I don't know how they're going to spin this, but it's bad. They set me up, plain and simple." She nodded, her face serious. "Ethan filled me in. It's clear they're trying to bury you, but we're not going to let that happen." She glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I've already started digging into Walker's record, and there are some red flags. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to raise questions." Marcus leaned against the bars, frustration seeping into his voice. "Questions aren't going to be enough. They've got the upper hand right now, and I'm not sure how much pull they have in this town." Sarah crossed her arms, her sharp gaze meeting his. "That's why we're going to take this outside of Cape May. I've already contacted the state police and the press. If they think they can keep this quiet, they're sorely mistaken." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The press?" Sarah nodded. "You need visibility, Marcus. They're counting on this being swept under the rug. But if we shine a light on it, it'll be a lot harder for them to cover their tracks." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened again, and Ethan stepped in, his face grim but determined. He walked up to the cell, glancing between Marcus and Sarah. "I can't believe this is happening," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I thought Cape May was better than this, but after seeing what they did tonight," he trailed off, his voice thick with disbelief. Marcus looked at him, grateful for the support but feeling the weight of the situation. "Ethan, I appreciate you stepping in back there. But you know they're going to come after you too now, right?" Ethan shrugged, his expression hardening. "Let them. I'm not going to sit by and watch them destroy a good man's life. Not again." The words hung in the air, and Marcus realized that Ethan had probably seen this kind of thing before, in one form or another. He wasn't just standing up for Marcus, he was standing up against a system that had likely wronged him and others in the past. Sarah spoke up, breaking the silence. "I'm filing an official complaint first thing in the morning, and I'll push for an external investigation. We've got enough to start making noise, but we're going to need more than that if we want to take this all the way." Marcus nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not backing down." Sarah gave him a tight smile. "Good, because this is going to get ugly before it gets better. They'll fight back, and they'll fight dirty." Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the tension in his body. "Let them. I've been through worse." With a plan forming and Sarah on his side, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. He had spent his life fighting for what was right, and this was just another battle, a different kind, but a battle nonetheless. The stakes were high, but Marcus wasn't alone. With Sarah's legal expertise and Ethan's support, he knew they had a chance to expose the corruption that had poisoned Cape May for too long. As the night stretched on, Marcus remained in the cell, but this time, the cold metal didn't feel so suffocating. He knew the fight ahead would be hard, but for the first time since his return to Cape May, he felt the weight of hope. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was packed. Word of Marcus's arrest and the subsequent investigation had spread far beyond Cape May, drawing the attention of state officials and the press. Cameras flashed outside as reporters swarmed to cover what had now become a much larger story about police corruption and abuse of power in small towns. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Marcus sat next to Sarah at the defense table, his back straight, his face calm. He knew that this moment, this trial, wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about something much bigger. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of Cape May's police force. At the prosecutor's table sat Walker, his face set in a hard, expressionless mask. The evidence had been stacked against Marcus from the start, but Sarah had spent the last week meticulously picking it apart, piece by piece. Walker might have been confident when he orchestrated the setup, but now, he looked uneasy. As the trial began, Sarah rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was calm, controlled, but every word hit like a hammer. She laid out the facts, Marcus's spotless record, the inconsistencies in the police report, and the suspicious timing of the call that had led him to the convenience store that night. But most importantly, she highlighted the history of complaints against Walker, complaints that had been buried by the department over the years. This is not a case of a man caught in the act of wrongdoing, Sarah said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. This is a case of a man who dared to stand up against a system that has long since forgotten what justice means. And now, that system is trying to silence him. The prosecution tried to dismiss Sarah's argument, painting Marcus as a disgruntled outsider who had come to Cape May with an agenda. But it was clear to anyone paying attention that their case was weak. They relied heavily on the testimony of Walker and Danvers, both of whom insisted that Marcus had been acting suspiciously on the night of the arrest. However, Sarah was ready for them. When it was time for cross-examination, she went after Walker with surgical precision. Officer Walker, Sarah began, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand, you testified that you received a call about a suspicious person at the convenience store on the night in question. Can you tell us who made that call? Walker shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. It came through dispatch. I don't know who called it in. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. Interesting. Because when we pulled the records from dispatch, there is no record of any call being made that night. In fact, it seems the only officers who were aware of the so-called suspicious activity were you and Officer Danvers. Care to explain that? Walker's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the prosecutor's table. Maybe there was a mistake with the records. Sarah smiled slightly, her voice steady. Or maybe there was never a call at all. Maybe you and Officer Danvers were waiting for Marcus Johnson to show up, knowing full well that he wasn't there to commit a crime but to be framed for one. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Sarah delivered the final blow. Walker's face flushed, and he stammered for a response, but the damage had been done. The jury was watching him closely now, doubt creeping into their expressions. Next, Sarah called Ethan to the stand. Ethan's testimony was critical, not just because he had been there that night, but because he was a local, someone the people of Cape May knew and trusted. I've lived in Cape May for nearly 10 years, Ethan began, his voice steady. And in all that time, I've seen things that didn't sit right with me. But what happened to Marcus Johnson was the last straw. I saw him that night, and I saw what Walker and the others did. It was a setup. Plain and simple. The prosecution tried to discredit Ethan, but he remained calm, unshaken by their attempts to poke holes in his story. His testimony painted a clear picture of the corruption that had taken root in Cape May, and it resonated with the jury. By the time Sarah delivered her closing argument, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. What had started as a case about one man's arrest had turned into a much broader indictment of the Cape May Police Department. Marcus Johnson served his country with honor, Sarah said, her voice strong and unwavering. He came to this town to continue that service, to protect and to serve the people of Cape May. But instead of being welcomed, he was met with hostility, with prejudice, and with a department more interested in maintaining its corrupt status quo than in upholding the law. This isn't just about Marcus. This is about all of us. About what kind of community we want to be, and whether we're willing to stand up to those who abuse their power. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, their faces were solemn, but Marcus could sense the shift in the air. He had been here before, waiting for the outcome of a battle. And this time, he wasn't alone. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. We find the defendant, Marcus Johnson, not guilty. Relief flooded Marcus's chest as the words sank in. He felt Sarah's hand on his shoulder, and Ethan grinned from the gallery, giving him a nod of solidarity. But the victory wasn't just his. The trial had exposed the rot in Cape May, and while the battle had been won, Marcus knew the war for justice was far from over. The state police had launched an investigation into the department, and Walker and Danvers were already facing disciplinary action. As Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, the sun shining bright overhead, he was greeted by the flashing cameras and the murmurs of reporters. But all he could think about was the road ahead, the long, difficult road toward change. Cape May wasn't fixed overnight. But with people like Sarah, Ethan, and the community now aware of the truth, there was hope. For Marcus, that was enough. He had fought for justice, and though the battle had been hard, he knew he had made a difference. As he walked away from the courthouse, his shoulders felt lighter, the burden of silence finally lifted. This was just the beginning.
Stories have the power to transform lives, and if this one moved you, imagine the next ones. Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of inspiration and reflection. If you have experienced something similar, or if this story brought back a special memory, share it in the comments. Your experience could inspire others. And don't forget to like the video and share it with someone you know will be just as inspired as you.